click record and we'll get things fired up. Okay.
Wes, can you see my screen?
I see it. See it great. Looks great on the Skype meeting here. Looks like you're resizing a little bit there. So for those folks who might be listening to this recording later on, this is our June meeting of the Raleigh-Durham Power BI user group. Tonight we have Sajas, who will be presenting on embedding within Power BI. So Sajas is in the room. Take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Wes.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Hey. My name is Sajas Salahuddeen. I'm a Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft. Work with Wes as well as Susan, who's over there. So we are part of the same team, part of the data insights and AI domain. So we do our work predominantly around the data platform, business intelligence, and advanced analytics. Just like Wes, I focus a lot on Power BI and related BI products within our Microsoft portfolio. I'm based out of the Charlotte office. I try my best to come here more often. So when Wes gave me this opportunity, I was like, yes, this is perfect. I'll just drive down and share some of the knowledge I would like to share, and then I'll go, but I'll try to keep coming back as much as I can. So Wes, if you don't mind me coming here more often, I would love to be back here sometime soon.
That would be great, yeah.
All right, so today's session is focused on Power BI embedding. Before I get started, just want to see how many of you have used Power BI? How many of you use it in a day-to-day basis? So I'm guessing you must be quite familiar with developing a Power BI solution, right? So building your Power BI reports, the data modeling aspect, the transformations, all of that. Cool. So in this session, we are not really going to look much into the Power BI solution development, right? I just want to be clear with that. However, if you do have questions around that, I'll spend probably 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this session to answer your questions. Okay. This session is focused more on the embedding of Power BI reports with any custom application. So for those of you who have worked with Power BI or have seen Power BI, you know one of the standout features with Power BI is you can quite easily build interactive and dynamic reports, right? So wouldn't it be cool to have these reports made available within your web applications? So a lot of vendors, a lot of software vendors are building intelligent products which contains all these interactive reports. And Power BI, using the REST APIs that is available for you to use, lets you basically embed your dynamic Power BI reports within a web application. So we are really going to see in this session how you can do that. I won't be showing you a lot of code. However, I plan to show a few demos and also how you can get started with the whole embedding of Power BI with your custom web applications. Okay, does that sound good for all of you? Perfect. And feel free to ask questions at any time. I'm very flexible as a presenter, so feel free to pause me if you have any questions. You don't have to wait till the very end. Okay. All right. So let's first talk about what Power BI embedding is. Right. Like I said, Power BI in itself lets you create very interactive, very powerful reports, and the embedding feature lets you embed that interactive reports in any custom application. Just be aware, your application could be a desktop application or a web application. However, for embedding to work, you should be, or the application should be connected to the internet. The reason being, Power BI is an online service. All the authentication and everything happens against the Azure Active Directory. So the application needs to be connected to the internet. Cool. Now, here's a typical example of an embedded Power BI solution. So before I even get in here, for those of you who have used Power BI, have you used just the Power BI desktop interface or have you also used the Power BI service?
Desktop.
Both. Desktop? Both?
Both.
All right. So let's actually take a step back and talk about all the different products we have in the Power BI product portfolio. First thing is the Power BI desktop, which is what we use for the solution development, right? So that's where you build your interactive Power BI reports, right? From getting data, transforming data, modeling the data, and eventually building the visualization. All of those pieces are done on the Power BI desktop tool. And as you know, the Power BI desktop tool is a free tool. There is no licensing cost involved. So you can build your solution, save your solution locally as a .pbix file, and then when you're ready to share and collaborate with your team or even external users, you'd use the Power BI service. Power BI service is the cloud hosted platform where you would host your Power BI solution, right? Now, Power BI service is not free, obviously, right? Microsoft needs to make money somehow. We give the desktop tool for free, which is a really powerful tool to build the solution. However, to share and collaborate, you'd need the Power BI service, which is licensed. On the Power BI service, after you publish the content, you can share it with your internal users or with external users. The general interface or the way you access your Power BI report is you sign into the Power BI service and access your reports. So let me actually pull up my Power BI service in here. This is the built-in web interface for your Power BI portal. I've already signed in here. I see my workspace where I have access to my dashboards, reports, and so on. You can build pretty visuals like these too, right? So Power BI supports a lot of standard visuals like your bar charts, your graphs, your line charts, all that. But along with that, you can use custom visuals as well, right? Now, this is a dashboard in Power BI, which contains just 3 tiles in here, which is highly interactive. If I click on any of these tiles, it takes me to the underlying report. This report is super interactive. I can click on any of this information in here, slice and dice my data, do all that. These are like the core features of Power BI. What I'm really trying to show you here is the way I access my report in this scenario is through the Power BI service. So I go to the powerbi.com website. I sign in using my work email address. Once signed in, I have access to the different dashboards and reports. These dashboards and reports could have been shared with me by somebody else, or these could be reports or dashboards that I have built myself. But this is the standard interface to access your Power BI content. Now, with Power BI embedding, what we give you is the option to have these reports or even a single tile from a dashboard and embed it in your custom application. It could be your internal website, maybe even a SharePoint site. It could be an external website. Maybe it's part of your application, right? You could have this interactive Power BI content embedded in your application. So in that scenario, what happens is instead of connecting or accessing your reports via this web Power BI service interface, you just use your application, your internal site or your external website and access your Power BI reports. Does that make sense? So, key thing to note is the Power BI service out here is still a critical component even with embedding. We still will be using this Power BI service to host our content. Okay, and then using the Power BI REST APIs, we would embed it in our custom application. That's the general workflow. We'll dig more into this, and I'll show you all the different ways in which you can do embedding. Here's a simple screenshot of an embedded Power BI application. So this application was built by a software vendor. They essentially have their own pieces in here. So if you notice at the top, these are all part of the application. And within that application interface, you can see Power BI reports like this as well. Okay. Now, the question is, how do we do it? Like I mentioned, in this session, I'm going to show you how you can get started with this whole Power BI embedded experience. I work with a lot of customers on Power BI projects. These days, the Power BI embedded has come up a lot with many of the customers I work with. One of the common challenges everyone's facing is the documentation for some reason around this is not very clear. It's kind of difficult to get started with this whole Power BI embedded solution development. In fact, that's something our product group acknowledges. So they have actually started making changes to the documentation and adding tools to make it easier to use Power BI in an embedded application. Okay, so what I'll do here is just make it easy for you to get started and also share some of the resources so you could build your Power BI embedded solution in the future. So here are the general steps. So the very first step is to build your Power BI solution. When I say Power BI solution, I'm really referring to the PBIX file. That's your Power BI file that you generate from your Power BI desktop tool, right? So here's my Power BI desktop. Here's an example of a Power BI file. So this is a Power BI solution that has in it a data model like this. Here's the visualization front end. As you can see, there are multiple pages. All these pages have visualizations, and these visuals are highly interactive as well, right? Once you save this solution, it will be saved with an extension of .pbix. Something like this in here. So all those .pbix files are my Power BI files, right? So the very first step is to build the Power BI solution using the Power BI desktop tool. There's a slight lag, bear with me there. So using the Power BI desktop tool, you build the Power BI reports that you want, right? That's the very first step. Now, once you have done that, the second step is to host this Power BI solution on the Power BI service. And the third step is to include that in any application using the Power BI REST API. Now, in the second step where you host the Power BI content on your Power BI service, you actually have a couple of options. And those options really depend on your scenario, who you'd want to share your content with, right? Typically, you may want to share content with some external users, or you may want to share content with some internal users, right? Now, if you think about it, with internal users, the way you'd want to authenticate will be way different from the way you'd want to authenticate external users. As an independent software vendor, if I'm building an application and then making that application available to millions of users, I don't want to authenticate each and every single user against the Power BI service. And I don't want to, more importantly, pay for the licensing for each of those individual users, right? That's definitely not going to be economical. On the other hand, if I'm working with just internal users, my application is something that's used internally, maybe within my team, or maybe thousands of users in my organization will be using it. In those cases, I might want to authenticate against my Active Directory, right? And also, it doesn't make a huge dent if I want to license those users individually as well, right? So again, depending on those two scenarios, you have options to host your Power BI solution in two different places. So we'll talk more about that. I mentioned it in the slide here, either use the Azure environment or the Power BI Premium. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So for external sharing, common scenarios are if you're building a packaged application, or if you're building some SaaS application or some external portals, right? So you would want to use the external sharing approach. The internal sharing, like I mentioned, typically it's an application that's used within your organization, right? Could be some of your line of business application, could be to embed in your internal websites or SharePoint Online, and so on and so forth. Okay? So broadly, when you embed your Power BI content and share it with users, you would either want to share with external users or with internal users. if your approach is to share with external users, there is a certain approach that we recommend. If you want to share your application with internal users, there is a different approach that we recommend. Any questions so far? At a high level, everything's clear as mud? Okay. All right. So start with the Power BI desktop. You build your content over there. Then you publish your content either to the Power BI service or to the Azure environment, depending on your embedding needs. And then you use the Power BI REST APIs to embed the Power BI content within your application. Those are the 3 general steps. Okay. Now, before I jump any further into embedding, I want to talk about licensing too, because this plays a huge role in your choices. Power BI Desktop, we've already talked about it. It's the free version. It's your developer environment. You build your Power BI solution from there, right? Even with embedding, you start with the Power BI Desktop. You build your content over there. After that, you publish your content to the Power BI service or Azure. That's where you have few options. Power BI Pro and Power BI Premium are part of the Power BI service. So when we talk about Power BI service, there are 2 licensing options. The first licensing option is where you would want to license individual users. It's called the Pro licensing. Second licensing option is where you license capacity. So if you have thousands of users, licensing those users individually may be quite costly. So in such cases, you may want to license by capacity. It's kind of like buying a virtual machine on the cloud and then pushing your content in there and then sharing that content with your users. It's not exactly that. I'd like to clarify, it's not a virtual machine that you have to buy, but it's sort of like that. In the Power BI service, you buy capacity. Capacity, you can actually define X number of cores, X amount of memory, and so on. And then you push your Power BI content into that capacity. With the Power BI Premium, you don't have to license every single user. You just have to license or use Pro license for the publishers, but the content consumers does not require individual license. So quick question to the group. For those of you who have used Power BI service, are you using the Pro license or anybody has started exploring the Power BI Premium? Pro, generally. Cool. So generally with any typical Power BI deployment, it's very common to see that organizations start with individual Pro license, right? You start with the Pro license, and as the Power BI usage in your organization increases and you're seeing hundreds or thousands of Power BI users, at that point, you may want to consider Power BI Premium. One advantage of Power BI Premium is, like I said, you don't have to license all the consumers of the Power BI report. Without Power BI Premium, you'd have to license every individual users, whether they publish content or whether they just view the content. With Premium, you just have to license the publishers individually, but for everybody else who's consuming the content, it's free, pretty much. Okay. This also means you can use Premium to share with external users. Like I said, you have your Power BI content, you then basically save that content in a Premium capacity. Anybody who wants to access this Premium content can access it without an individual license. And that applies even for external users. That's the key thing to keep in mind. So Power BI Premium licensing model gives you the ability to share your content with external users as well as internal users without having to explicitly buy individual Pro licenses for those users. Make sense? Premium gives you a lot of other advantages too, like it gives you better performance because it's dedicated capacity and all that. Again, this session is not really focused just on Premium, so I'll skip that part. But just be aware, Premium gives you a lot more capabilities than just the external sharing option that I just mentioned. Cool. Now, you have another option for hosting your Power BI content, and that option is on the Azure platform. This is where things get a little complicated. So when we generally talk about Power BI embedded, right, we are talking about this Azure service called Power BI embedded. The Power BI embedded service in Azure is basically a service that lets you host Power BI files. In this scenario, you are basically paying per usage. So how it works is you don't even have to buy Power BI license, the Pro or the Premium. You could just buy Power BI embedded service and then host your Power BI content in that service and then embed your Power BI content in your application. Note that the Power BI embedded approach is recommended and in fact can be used only for external sharing. Okay, so if you are a software vendor, you are building an application where you'd want to use Power BI content, this is what we recommend, the Power BI embedded service. Why? Because first of all, you don't need to share with internal users. You don't need to really integrate with other Microsoft products or even with Azure Active Directory at that point. All you'd want to do is have a place to host your content and then have that content embedded within your application so that it can be shared with external users. So to quickly summarize, if you want to do internal sharing of Power BI, you could use the Power BI Pro or Power BI Premium. If you'd want to do external sharing of Power BI content, you could either use the Power BI Premium or the Power BI Embedded service. Note that Power BI Pro license alone will not let you do external sharing. On the other hand, Power BI Embedded service will not give you options just for internal sharing. However, keep in mind that there are ways to do it that way. Our general recommendation is, if you want to embed and share your content for external users, use the Power BI Embedded Azure service or the Power BI Premium. If you'd want to embed and share the content with internal users, use Power BI Premium or just with the Power BI Pro license. Did that make sense? Questions? This comes up a lot in my discussions with my customers. It's very important that you understand how the licensing works, because this plays a key role in what approach you take, whether you're going to buy Power BI Premium for embedding and sharing, or whether you're going to use just the Azure-based Power BI embedded service. Make sense? Anybody here has used Azure or any of the Azure services? Yay! All right, so the licensing for this is different from the Power BI service licensing. So just keep that in mind. In general, the Power BI embedded service is way cheaper than Power BI Premium. Okay. Here's a quick summary. So use Power BI service. When I say Power BI service, just on the left-hand side, when I say Power BI, I'm referring to either the Power BI Pro or the Power BI Premium license. Use that if you're an enterprise looking for a complete BI solution. You want to have a single view of what's happening in your organization, all that. Basically, if you want to have a solution built for your organization. In such a scenario, use Power BI. On the other hand, use the Power BI Embedded Azure service if you are an ISV or a developer and you'd want to build applications that contain Power BI reports, and more importantly, you'd want to share that application with a number of external users. All right?
I got a question.
Yes.
You said be able to do a share with a public link, right?
You can, yes. I will show that option as well. So sharing with a public link is what we call the publish to web feature.
Right.
That option gives you a basic link to your report, which you can embed in your application, right? So with that approach, what you're doing is, okay, here's the link. This is the static public URL. to my report, and I just use that in my report or share that link with anybody in the world. They can have access to that report. But oftentimes, if you think about any software, any application, there will be other components in there. Maybe for authentication, the vendor might have their own processes, right? They may have their own security module. And based on that, they'd want to make some of the Power BI content available in a certain page or not, right? In such cases, you cannot use that publish to web public URL just for everything. That's where the Power BI REST APIs come into play. Right? With that, you can programmatically give access the way you want. Maybe you have a separate security module. Based on that, authentication is done. If the authentication is now successful, you can have in your program, basically using the Power BI REST APIs, the embedding done. Right? So again, it depends on the scenario. If you want simple embedding of a report on a public website, you could use that approach that you mentioned, the publish to web option. If you would want to embed in an application which is more sophisticated, has other security options and maybe other pieces in that application, you would want to use the REST API based approach.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
It did. I knew there was that.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if it had changed or not.
No, it's still there.
Things change so fast.
Yep, it does. One of the biggest challenge for us engineers in the field is just keeping up with this product. Every month things change. When Wes was talking about the upcoming change, I was like, okay, that's good to know, because I didn't attend that session that Wes mentioned, and I was not even sure about that. Okay, cool. So yeah, this product is evolving so fast, it's a challenge for us to keep up with it. All right, so I will be sharing this slide deck with Wes. He'll probably share it with you guys. It has a little bit more information on the different licensing options and so on. I don't want to really spend more time on this, but at least at a high level, once you leave this session, keep in mind that you have two options for embedding. One is just using the core Power BI service, where you have two licensing options, Pro or the Premium. And the second one is the Power BI Embedded, which is in Azure, where you typically use embedding for external users. If you remember that much, yeah, that this session is successful, at least for me. All right. So let me actually show you a few things on the Power BI service first. All right, since I'm already here, so this is my Power BI service. So I'm connected, signed in using a demo account. Here, this is a Power BI report that's already published. If you go to the file option, this one doesn't have that. So all right, so this is the one you were talking about, right? The publish to web.
Right.
So let me, so I just want to show you what this is. So if I have a report like this, I can go to File and click on Publish to Web, and I can create an embed code. So publish, which will essentially generate a static URL to this report. It also creates an iframe with that URL, so you can embed it in any application. Any user who has access to this URL can essentially open it. So if I just simply copy paste that URL out here, you'll see that that report is viewable. Right? So if I use that iframe code in my HTML page, I could embed this report in my application too. Cool. With this approach, I'm essentially saying that, hey, I have this report, just embedding it, no security and nothing. It's a useful feature in some cases, but we generally don't recommend using it unless you have a good use case for it, right? Because if you think about it, it's a huge security risk. When Power BI was introduced almost, yeah, or at least when this feature was introduced almost 2 years back or 1.5 years back, everybody started using this as a way of sharing. The reason for using this feature was because this is available in the free version. So even if you use the Power BI service for free, you could use that feature. So people thought, okay, that's an easy way of sharing. So I'll create a URL, I'll share it with my teammates. That's fine. However, there is always a risk that URL would go out of your organization. Somebody posts it in Facebook, right? And if you have sensitive data in your reports, well, you can imagine the problems with that. So use this approach only if you have certain reports that can be shared publicly. I've seen a lot of customers use it for basically use certain reports with public information and use those reports in their external website. In all other cases, we do not encourage using this option. Talking about embedding options, there is another one, embedding to SharePoint Online. In fact, in my slide deck, I have actually added these two as well. So once I share it and you check that, you'll see that these options are also included in my slide. So embedding to SharePoint Online makes it a little easy to embed content to a SharePoint Online page. Anybody here using SharePoint? Pretty much everybody, most, at least a majority. How about SharePoint Online? Cool, few of you. All right, so a lot of organizations still prefer to use SharePoint Online as their front end, right? So even for a BI portal, all the reports could be accessed via SharePoint. Nothing wrong with that, right? And it makes sense too. You don't want your users to go to different platforms to access different kinds of report. It'll be cool to have all the important report in one place, whether it's a SharePoint portal or somewhere else, right? So what Power BI does is it makes it easy to embed your Power BI reports in a SharePoint Online page. However, note that it still uses the Power BI service behind the scenes. So security or sharing has to be done here first. Licensing, all the rules still apply. You need to either have an individual pro license or Power BI premium license to even share, right? All of that has to be done first. Once all that is done, you can click on that link, which will generate an embedded URL for SharePoint Online. And then you can use that URL and then create a SharePoint web part and just copy the URL. It's as simple as that, right? So embedding to SharePoint Online is one approach to embedding, which is for internal sharing. Just that we have made it easy to do the embedding with the SharePoint web part. Okay, but behind the scene, it uses the Power BI REST APIs that I have mentioned already. All right. Now that we have talked about embedding SharePoint Online and publish to web, let's look at the other options. So I'm going to go here. And I'll bring this URL to your attention. This is one of the best tools we have to test out embedding. I have included the URL to this in the slide deck. So if you look at the slide deck, I think at the very end, I have added some resources too. So you'd have access to those links as well. Now, here, you can test out embedding. If I want to embed a sample report, here's how it would look. So click on the sample report here. I can just simply say run. And here you have the report. Similarly, if I go back, here are some samples on embedding a dashboard itself. So if I click on front here, here's the dashboard that's embedded in this web page. Now, what I want to bring to your attention is these key pieces. So behind the scene, this website or the sample tool uses the Power BI REST APIs to do the embedding. Now, to do the embedding, we have to pass in our code certain parameters. One is, if I'm embedding a dashboard, I have to pass in the dashboard ID. If I'm embedding a report, I have to embed and pass in the report ID and so on, right? Before that, I may have to authenticate the users, right? And also, based on the authentication, I have to generate an access token. And then I also may have to generate the embed token. Anyway, I will be walking through all that. But if you notice here in the sample, those are the three parameters I have to pass in. I had to pass in the embed token, the embed URL, and the dashboard ID. Right? In this case, we are just using some of the samples, but soon I'll show you in code how you can generate these tokens and the IDs. There are some really good GitHub samples too. Samples in GitHub which you can use. It's all .NET based examples. So if you use Visual Studio, you can simply open these, just change some of the parameters and get your first Power BI embedded solution ready. Okay. Go here. Talk about the key steps in embedding. So first thing, you have to use a workspace in the Power BI service or in Azure to host your content. Okay, that's the very first step. Second step, you add your Power BI content to that workspace. Then you have to create the application and register the application. And then it's a matter of using the Power BI REST APIs to import your packages and then enhance the code to do the embedding. So let's go here to my Power BI workspace. All right, so if you look here, here's my Power BI workspace. This Power BI workspace is a Power BI premium workspace. Okay. Now, Power BI premium licensing, as I said, gives you the option to license by capacity. So you pay per capacity, and then you can create workspaces and assign workspaces to that capacity, right? So if you look at this workspace here, it's called SAJ, SAL Premium WS. There is a diamond icon next to it, meaning that it is part of the premium capacity. If a workspace is part of the premium capacity, technically I can share the content within this workspace with any internal user or even with external users through code, right? So if I use the Power BI REST APIs, I can technically embed these reports in an external application and share it with external users. So the very first step is to create this workspace. And once I have created the workspace, I add my reports or my dashboards. Basically, whatever content I want to embed, I will be adding it to this workspace. So if you look at this workspace here, I have dashboards like these. I have reports, and all of this can be embedded in any application. Another way of creating the workspace is using the Power BI embedded Azure service. So if I go to my Azure, so again, I won't go much into the details of the Azure platform and all the different services here, but key thing to note is for Power BI embedding, there is an Azure service called Power BI Embedded. I've already created one. It looks like this. I've named this SAJ PBI Embedded. Here you can see that it's a simple Azure service which I have started. That's pretty much all I do. And also there are different pricing options depending on the workload. I can buy a higher priced tier with much higher capacity, or I could just start with the lowest tier. So in this case, I'm using the A1 tier, which is almost free. It's the cheapest option out there. So for this demo, I've just spun up this particular Power BI embedded Azure service. Now, once you have a Power BI embedded Azure service created, if you go to your Power BI portal, click on your admin portal, you'll see this option. Right? So this is basically available within my Power BI. So although I have not really bought a Power BI Pro or a premium license, I can still use this Power BI embedded Azure service to host my Power BI content. Okay, so this particular workspace that I have here is tied to this particular embedded capacity. So if we take a few steps back, when I started off, I said that there are two ways for embedding, right? Either use the Power BI using the premium license or use the Azure service. In both cases, you first buy those, either the Power BI premium license or the Power BI embedded Azure service, and then the next step is to assign a workspace to that particular service. This is what tells whether I can actually embed my content for sharing externally or not. If my content is on a workspace that is tied to an Azure Power BI embedded service, or if it's tied to a Power BI premium capacity, I can technically embed the content in any custom application and share it even externally if I choose. That's what we have done here. Okay. So this workspace is part of a dedicated capacity, and so technically all the content within this workspace can be embedded in any application and even shared externally. Now, if I go back here, the next step is, if you see here, so we have the workspace, we have the content also included in the workspace. So we are ready to do the embedding. The next step is to really build the application. Before you build the application, there is one more step that you need to do, which is to register your application with Azure Active Directory. This is a very tricky thing to do, I would say, but we have made it much easier using a simple tool for registering the application. So if I go here, we have what we call the onboarding tool, which lets you simply register any application, that's your embedded application, with Azure Active Directory. This is a wizard-driven solution. So what it asks you here is, hey, are you going to embed for your customer or are you going to embed for your organization? Depending on that scenario. So embedding for your customer is what we refer to as external sharing. If I choose this option, it'll take me through this wizard. I sign in and I just fill in this information in here, and I can complete the registration. This is a very important step because if you think about it, your application first has to be registered with Azure AD so that when you do the embedding, it can complete the authentication successfully, right? So next, this is where I am registering my application, and also at this step I assign the different permissions for my application to Azure Active Directory objects. An equivalent of this, if you do it internally, is in some cases in your application, you may want to assign permissions to some of your on-premises Active Directory objects. Right? Here we are essentially saying that this application, which will have the embedded Power BI content, will need access to do some of these things, right? So it should have access to read the workspaces, read the reports, and so on and so forth. You can technically select all in here and continue on to register the application. So I've already done this part for you. So if I go here, so under app registrations, you'll see that these are some of the applications I have registered with my Azure Active Directory. Once you have registered an application, it will return an application ID, which is what is required within your application. So when you use the Power BI REST APIs, the very first step is where you do the authentication, At that point, you will need this application ID. Okay, so again, I won't go much into the details of all this, but just want to show you the key components. So application registration is required. Once you register the application, make sure you note the app ID. This is what you need to use within your Power BI REST APIs for completing the embedding. So let's go back here. And this sample that I'm going to show you here is essentially what you have in GitHub. So if you really want to test it out, you have the GitHub sample available. The URL to this is included in my slide deck. So make sure you want to test out, just download this application, open it in Visual Studio and run the code. You may have to change some of the parameters, and all the information about that is included in here. All right, so let me open up this config file. There are certain parameters that I had to pass in here. And one of the parameters over here at the top you see is the client ID, which is equivalent to the application ID. Now remember, I said that depending on your embedding scenario, you may have to take two different approaches. One is embedding internally and the other one is embedding externally, right? With embedding internally, you may want to authenticate the users using their work email address, right? We also call this approach, or internal embedding, as user owns data. So if you look at some of the Power BI documentation, you may see the term embedding for user owns data. That means that you're embedding for your internal customers. The other one is what we refer to as app owns data, which is for external sharing. The key difference, if you think about it, is with external sharing, you can't really authenticate every individual external users against Power BI. So what we do is we have a master account which has a Power BI Pro license. Anytime anybody accesses the application, we use this master account. Think of it like a proxy account which we use for authentication, right? For internal users, it's different because you don't want to use a proxy account. Instead, you want to basically authenticate your internal users, and based on their permission level, you'd want to show them the Power BI reports or not, right? So again, depending on those two scenarios, the way embedding works is also different. What also means is some of the implementation of the usage of the REST APIs are also going to be different. In the case of external sharing or app owns data, you'd see a config file like this. I have my password in there in plain text, which I will be changing. So I know it's being recorded somewhere at the bottom. All right. Anyway, the key things that we are passing is the URL to the Power BI REST APIs. I'm also passing the client ID. This is the application ID I got when I registered the application on Azure Active Directory. I also have to pass the group ID in here, which is the corresponding workspace where the content is being shared inside Power BI, right? And then this is the proxy account or the master account, which I'm using to authenticate to show the content. These are the key pieces. And then the Power BI REST API has methods to basically do the authentication and all that. I will quickly show you the Power BI REST APIs. So because it's a REST API, you can technically call this from pretty much any programming language. We do have SDKs for .NET. We do also have a JavaScript-based SDK, which you can readily use. But keep in mind, because it's all HTTP REST API calls, you could technically use any programming language to do this. Okay. What I want to show you is the Power BI REST API reference in here. Will show you all the available methods. For example, if you want to get a dashboard from your Power BI service, then this is the endpoint to access that method, right? Again, the parameters that needs to be passed is included. So you may want to pass the dashboard key and so on. If you have to authenticate, keep in mind that we use Azure Active Directory based authentication. We use the OAuth 2 protocol. Also, it uses REST API calls to do the authentication. The implementation of those REST API calls and everything is included and available in our documentation. Right? Again, like I said, I don't want to go into the details of how this code is, but it's available for you to download. Whenever you have time, make sure you test it out. I will also share this with Wes. I will probably add this in the user group portal somewhere. Okay. Now, let me just quickly run this. This example in here is the app owns data example, where I'm embedding for external users. So here's my application. So here you can see that within my application code, I have included different options. I can embed a report or a dashboard or a tile. So in here, if I click on this button, basically I have the code implemented using the Power BI REST API to find the very first report in my workspace and then embed that in this frame out here. Now the key thing to note is within this application, I could have additional parts too. So I could have data coming in from other reports also added in here if I choose to. I could also pass parameters into this report or embedded report programmatically and do a lot more, right? This is a bare minimal simple embedding example where I have just found the report in my workspace, got the report ID, used it to embed in my application out here. Okay, this is the same report that I have in this workspace. So if I go back to my workspace here, yeah, probably not this one. Okay. This is the same report that I have embedded in my application. All right. You could use the same approach to embed dashboards too if you choose. So instead of embedding reports, you can also embed dashboard, you can embed tiles and a lot more. The key thing to note is you have Power BI REST APIs, which will support all different kinds of embedding options. You can essentially, in your application code, have any logic in there to embed an entire report, entire dashboard, or even select tiles from a dashboard. Authentication again depends on your embedding scenario. If you're embedding for external users, you would typically use a proxy account or like a master account. If you're embedding for an internal users, you would typically use the user's credential and authenticate them against your Azure Active Directory. All right, any questions so far? All good? Either everything is super clear or nothing is. Like I said, embedding is one of those scenarios that's coming up a lot as Power BI is evolving. Everyone's seeing the power of Power BI, the interactivity and all that, right? The core functionality in Power BI is to give insights quickly. Now, a lot of software vendors are seeing a lot of potential in Power BI reports and embedding these reports in their application, right? So they don't have to build any complex software to create reports and dashboards and so on. You build it through Power BI, use your Power BI desktop, build your sophisticated, highly intelligent reports, and then you can simply take that report, plug it into any of your custom application. You could then choose to make this application available to external users or make it available to your internal users. So again, depending on your scenario, we talked about this already, you have different choices. Either use Power BI Premium for internal or external, or use Power BI Pro just for internal, or you could use Power BI Embedded Azure Service just for external share. Okay? Any questions? All right, so I'll quickly wrap up with this. So a typical development flow for embedding Power BI to custom web application. First step is you need to create an app workspace. You can create it either using your Power BI service, or you can, I'll repeat. So you have to create an app workspace. The question is where you host this app workspace. You can do that either on the Power BI service or on the Azure Power BI embedded service. Okay. In your app workspace, you create or host your Power BI content. This content can be then shared or embedded in your application and then either shared internally or externally. Now, before you proceed, you'll have to first register your application against Azure Active Directory. That's a very important step. After you have registered your application with Azure Active Directory, you can then programmatically using Power BI REST APIs embed your Power BI content in your application. The content that you can embed are the reports, the dashboards, or the tiles within a dashboard. Power BI also supports the Q&A feature. We recently released some updates to the API, which supports embedding the Q&A feature also on your application. So you'll see a lot of changes in the future. This is one area we are constantly evolving. I won't be surprised to see a lot more options available through the Power BI REST APIs for embedding. Also, last but not least, note that we have a JavaScript API for Power BI, which can be used to enhance the user interaction or the client-side behavior of your embedded application. So I'll just quickly show an example of that and we will wrap up. If you see this sample tool, and if I go to the samples, notice that apart from report, dashboard, and tile, okay, you can also embed specific report visual or Q&A. This is the one I was talking about. If I click on the code here, see this interact button, gives a few options on how your application can interact with the Power BI reports. So let's say, for example, I want to make this report available in full screen. I can simply click on this. It will show the corresponding JavaScript call to make this report as in full screen. So if I just simply run on really the method is this, the full screen method. If I click on run, there you go. Similarly, a few other things that you can do, again, depending on the example. If I embed, let's say, a report from this, go to the interact option, you'll see a lot more options. In fact, in your application, you can give the option to edit reports. So I can edit a Power BI report using this option. So how about that? Basically, you have an application where you can even edit your Power BI content. There are other JavaScript calls that we have added in this tool for navigation and so on. We have a lot of methods available for you. I don't expect you to remember all of this, but just know that there is a tool out there which which makes it easy for you to test out the embedding and all the different options you have for embedding and testing out the different interactions. Okay. Questions? Are we good? All right. So there's some more information out here. In fact, even how the authentication works, it's all in there in this slide deck. So I will be sharing this with Wes, and we will publish it somewhere so that you can access it. And here's the list of resources for you to get started with. All right, so quickly wrap up and summarize this session. So this session was on Power BI embedding, how you can use the power of Power BI in your custom application. For embedding, we have the Power BI REST APIs, which lets you programmatically add your Power BI content in any custom application, whether it's your dashboard, report, tiles, Q&A, and other features. Embedding can be done on application which is shared to external users or with internal users. The options that you have or the choice you make will be different if you want to embed for internal users as opposed to external users. Key thing to note is the licensing option. Power BI comes with Pro and Premium license on the Power BI service. Power BI also gives you the Azure Power BI embedded service if you want to share with external users through an embedded application. Okay, you start with creating a workspace. You then host this workspace either on the Power BI service or in the Power BI service under the Power BI Premium capacity or on the Power BI embedded Azure service, right? And then you publish your Power BI content to this workspace. The content is developed using the Power BI desktop tool. Once the content is published to the Power BI service, technically you can now embed that content in your application. Next step is make sure your application is registered with Azure Active Directory, and then it's a matter of using the Power BI REST APIs to programmatically embed your content in your application. Okay? Any last questions before we wrap up this session? As promised, we'll be done before 7:30, so we have 10 more minutes, and I said that if you have any other questions, general questions, even outside of this topic, on how to use Power BI or how to develop content for Power BI, anything at all, just let me know.
Where'd you get the fish tank visual?
Perfect. All right. Yes, Chris.
I had a question regarding the embedding. Have you run into any customers who have requested to authenticate users for embedded reports that are both internal and external from their organization? So covering both in a single presentation.
Got it. So in those scenarios, we recommend using the Power BI Premium license, first of all.
Okay.
If you think about it, so let me further ask this question, Wes. So in a given scenario, would you want to authenticate the user internally or using the external method? So
right.
Or let me rephrase that. So you said that you have users both internal and external. Is it the same user that you want to authenticate differently based on different scenarios?
No, it's both. Basically, the scenario that the customer presented to me that I hadn't run into before was they have some reporting needs through their internally developed application that they've already got this app written. They just want to include reporting on top of it. And internally, they have some security that they have built around that employees will be able to see a large amount of the data. Then they want to also present other segments or other slices of the data for some of their customers, but the customers won't be able to see everything that the internal users will be able to see, and the external customers will be authenticated not through Windows domain style authentication, but through the application itself. They'll have a username and a password. And I hadn't run into that before, and I didn't know if we had any specific suggestions or any type of guidance on that.
Yeah, so in those scenarios, our recommendation is to first use the Power BI Premium. The reason being, with Power BI Premium, if the content is hosted in a Power BI Premium capacity, you could share both internally as well as externally. Right. So for internal sharing, we use the approach called the user owns data. So programmatically, you will have the code written to basically authenticate your internal users against Azure Active Directory. Okay. Now for external users, in that same application, you would want to have a different authentication mechanisms, right? So maybe the application, like you said, has some security module which does the authentication. Once it passes that authentication, what we would do is use a master account, what we call the proxy account, which has a Power BI Pro license, to basically connect to the Power BI content and then embed it in the application. So short answer is the scenario that you mentioned, yes, we can definitely build a single application to authenticate both internal and external users. Just have to make sure within code you identify internal users and use a different approach for authentication. And in the same code, you identify the external user and use a different approach for authentication. If you use Power BI Premium, you basically can authenticate both kinds of users.
Okay. So with that, I would need to because I would need to authenticate them differently, I would need to have separate copies of any reports that would be in common between the two groups. So I would have to have, is that safe to say?
You can use the same report and make it available to both internal and external users. You could technically do that. However, we generally wouldn't recommend that, again, for security reasons. Ideally, we would want to have that separation. So for internal users, maybe always access one copy of the report. For external, you could point them to the other copy. But technically, you could have a single report and make it available to both internal and external users programmatically.
So possible, but not advisable.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Very good. All right. Well, I'm sorry. I'll let you answer the other question in the room there now. I see you've got the custom visual.
The fish. So if you go to, there are two ways to get to your custom visuals. The easiest way is right from here. Click on this ellipsis and select Import to Marketplace, which will open up all the different custom visuals available in a marketplace. Right? This particular, the fish tank, it's called Aquarium.
I tried to search for fish.
Called Aquarium. Enlighten Aquarium, that's the name.
Okay.
The list of custom visuals keep growing. I think we have more than 100 right now, and these are really awesome custom visuals. This is one area where Power BI is head and shoulder above some of its similar competing products.